It's Monday, the 4th of October 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Tumbling equity markets and what happens next is our main story this morning. Plus, we look at who the most powerful business leaders are in the country, the COVID numbers in New South Wales fall and keep rising in Victoria, and house prices just keep running. Then, stay listening for Sean's chat to Michelle Romanow, the Canadian entrepreneur that wants to invest $100 million in Australia using a very unusual model. Now, with half the country on a public holiday today, bit of a shorter show this morning, but let's get into it. Sean, September lived up to its reputation as being a bad month for shares, with the local market down nearly 3%. That continued on Friday, with the market falling another 2%. What can we expect now as we run into October?
Pretty tough question, that one, Michael. What can we expect in October? You're right, the market was down 2.7% during September. Remember, September, over the last 35 years, has consistently been the worst month of the year, and it proved it again this time round. In the US, shares were down nearly 5%. Bond yields rose, and that reflects fears about inflation, and oil prices jumped during the month. But to answer your question, AMP Capital's Shane Oliver put a note out over the weekend suggesting that in the next few weeks, there's still a strong risk of a severe correction. That means markets falling quite a bit. He said being highly sensitive to the global growth cycle means the local share market is more vulnerable to some international concerns, such as the slowdown in China that we know about, the energy crisis in parts of Europe, particularly the United Kingdom and Asia, and rising inflationary pressures. Dr. Oliver also highlighted the need for very, very high vaccination rates to prevent spikes in cases. Now, we've already seen in Israel and Singapore, where they've reopened economies at 80% vaccination rates, big spikes. So that's still ahead of us. Looks like it will be a rocky path throughout October for share markets.
Yeah, so how did markets perform over the weekend?
Well, I mentioned the local market. It had a shocker on Friday, finishing 2% lower. The benchmark index closed on 7,186 points, back to where it was in late May, and off nearly 6% from its high in mid-August. The fall in the ASX 200 was pretty widespread, with many large stocks tumbling. Commonwealth Bank was the big one. It was off more than 4%. Really unusual for the biggest company in the country to drop that much. Aristocrat Leisure is another really strong performer recently. It was off 4%. Rio Tinto and Macquarie Group were both down nearly 3%. But the worst of the day went to Virgin Money. It's actually a UK-based financial services group listed here in Australia. It tumbled nearly 8%. On the flip side, the gold companies were among the best on Friday, with Silver Lake Resources and Gold Road Resources being the best on the bourse, up around 4%. Northern Star Resources rose 2.5%, while Newcrest Mining jumped 1%. The price of gold itself jumped more than 3% in that last 24-hour period last week. It was a pretty strong finish over the weekend for Wall Street as well. Nasdaq was up 0.7%, but the S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial Averages, they were both up more than 1%. Quite the opposite in Europe, where major indices were lower. And Michael, the Aussie dollar is trading at 72.5 US cents.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, plenty of stories around this morning.
Sure is, Michael. Let's start on the COVID news. New South Wales said it was likely to hit the 70% vaccination target by the middle of this week. Great news for everyone in that state. Its recorded cases are on the decline, particularly in the Sydney region, though they are on the rise in rural parts of the state. The same can't be said of Victoria. Premier Daniel Andrews said it would only be a few more weeks until residents of the state could be freer, notwithstanding there were another 1,220 cases recorded yesterday. There were 38 cases in the ACT and none in Queensland, which of course allowed the football to go ahead last night.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, Sean, it's also the time of year that the Financial Review releases its list of the most powerful figures in the country. Late last week, we saw the list for politics, and we discussed that a bit yesterday in our Sunday show. But there's also a list for business leaders.
That's right. The business leaders, number one, Michael, who do you think should be the top rated?
Oh, I'd probably say the CEO of the biggest company, Commonwealth Bank CEO Matt Comyn.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Matt Comyn seems to have been everywhere. He's been ranked number one by the Financial Review, and I think that's probably fair enough. He seems to be a player in many issues just beyond banking. Some CEOs like to stick to their knitting. Matt Comyn is one who's happy to speak out away from it. Number two is Fortescue's Andrew Forrest. Number three is Rob Scott from Wesfarmers. I think that's an interesting choice, Rob Scott. But if you look at Wesfarmers, not just its retail at Bunnings, Officeworks, but also its chemical works and agriculture businesses, it really is throughout the economy. Number 4 is Mike Henry from BHP. No surprise there, given what he did last month, totally changing the direction of the big Australian. And number 5 is Brad Banducci from Woolworths. That's probably higher up the list than normal, but given the role Woolworths and Coles have played during COVID, that's probably fair enough too.
Yeah, probably makes sense. And Sean, the housing market doesn't want to give up.
No, it doesn't. CoreLogic figures released on Friday show that nationally, house prices rose more than 20% for the year ended September. And in Sydney, property was up 29%. The median price of a house in Sydney is now $1.4 million. I have no idea how people, particularly first homeowners, can get into that market. It's yet another reason why regulators are likely to jump in and try and take the heat out of the market. Incredible price rises.
Now, running through some of the other stories around over the weekend, there was plenty of follow-on from the shock resignation of New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian on Friday. Generally, it's been pretty sympathetic to Ms Berejiklian and respectful of the job that she's done running the state, not just during the COVID crisis, but really for the 4.5 years she was Premier.
What I loved about it, I think within the first 24 hours, it was St Gladys. Everyone loved Gladys Berejiklian, and then suddenly it just started to emerge. Not everyone loved her, and so Sunday's media was much harsher than Saturday's media. The Liberal Party needs a new leader. Clearly, they're gathering tomorrow with State Treasurer Dominic Perrottet favoured over Planning Minister Rob Stokes to take the position. The other news out of that state yesterday, the Transport Minister Andrew Constance has quit and will run for the seat of Gilmore in federal parliament next election. And just one other thing, Michael, the outgoing chief executive of Sigma Healthcare, Mark Hooper, has quit from the board of the company but will remain as CEO until January as planned. It's really unusual for someone who's CEO and on the board to quit the board before they actually quit as CEO. There's been talk in the market that he wasn't happy with Sigma's decision to bid for API, its main competitor, trumping the Wesfarmers offer. Maybe that's what's prompted the decision.
Yeah, interesting one, that one. What's the key overseas news this morning?
Well, the Democrats in the US are still fighting over whether or not to pass their own $1.25 trillion infrastructure bill. It's actually a bipartisan bill, so the Republicans are voting for it, and the Democrats can't decide whether to vote for it or not, even though Joe Biden is a Democrat. They've been given another month, and the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has urged her colleagues to stop squabbling. Well said. The infrastructure bill is a central part of the president's legislative agenda and really important for financial markets. And also, Michael, Tesla delivered a better than expected 241,000 cars worldwide during their September quarter. That's a record for the electric car maker. Now, whatever Tesla does is seen as a barometer for consumer demand for EVs, and it just shows how popular electric vehicles are becoming globally.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Sean, but it's still a bit of a novelty for me whenever I see a Tesla around. I'll never be able to afford one, but I still like to see them.
Yeah, no, I'm with you totally. I would love the idea of owning one, but I think it's a pipe dream.
Absolutely. All right, up next is the Daily Interview. And today, Sean, you're talking to Michelle Romano. She's very impressive. Canadian entrepreneur, investor, TV personality in her mid-30s, bringing a brand new funding model for startups to Australia.
Yes, Michael, it's a great interview. Michelle is full of energy. She's bringing her own way of lending to small and medium-sized borrowers into Australia. She calls it a fee. It's an interest rate of 6% on whatever you borrow off her, but she doesn't take security. She doesn't take equity in it. It's a really interesting funding model and potentially will disrupt lending to SMEs.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interview, that one. It's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. While you're there, have a listen as well to the Sunday edition from yesterday, which is a bit of a lighter look at some of the news from the last week or so. And also, of course, the week ahead with our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas. A bit on this week, Sean.
Yeah, the Kook's great when it comes to this sort of stuff, and he loves any time that there's a week that the Reserve Bank's talking. Its board meets tomorrow, and then late in the week, its financial stability report comes out. Stephen gives us a rundown about what to expect.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thanks, Michael.
It's Monday, the 4th of October, 2021. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook, and sign up for our free daily newsletter at fearandgreed.com.au. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.